Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Phillips, and I'm here to talk about a new application that I have essentially started a company for called Grokism. Grokism is, you can think of it as an oracle, an identity authentication authorization oracle for, I'm going to very specifically say midnight. And so we're just going to talk here a little bit about midnight. If you go to https midnight.network, you can get some very specific information about it. You can go through some tutorials and you can learn how to write smart contracts and zero knowledge proofs on Midnight Network. But Midnight Network by itself isn't going to solve the problem. So the problem, you can make your identity portable, at least to some degree. You can make your identity portable by using something like OpenID Connect, OIDC. In and of itself, that provides some identity information that is then passed to an application that calls it. So even something like Midnight, typically I expect that it's going to use OpenID Connect to provide some sort of identity and authentication and authorization um, in within its app. Um, but the problem with that, with making it portable, um, because OpenID Connect, so if you think about Google, when you create an application that uses login with Google, right? Um, what it does is on the backside, Google has some identity information that you've already signed up for. Like if you have an email address provided by Google, right? What it will allow you to do then is use the OpenID Connect services to log into that particular set of, information and then pull it back to an application and then an application can use it. So you'll see these sort of things all over the place where you say login with Google. Now they have login with Apple, or now they have login with GitHub, whatever it is. So there's a whole variety of things. So that does provide some portable um, sort of access to your identity, right? It's either that or two, um, the application, you can provide OAuth, which is essentially the application taking ownership of your identity, right? So what happens is um, an application wants to give you access to a certain set of resources, and then what they do is they have an open OAuth, they have an OAuth server on location or somewhere in the cloud or whatever it is. And then what it does is it provides a token, provides a session token. Sometimes uh, that session token basically is used in your application then to provide access to resources. And there's all kinds of examples of this. I mean, typically, you go to a website, you log in, there's a login button, so on and so forth, your name, you put your name and your password in there. And then what happens is you click the login button and the application then asks for a session token, which is provided by an OAuth service. I mean, there's some really great examples of this, like, X does this, Facebook does this. But they may go so far as to create an OpenID server themselves too, right? But in every case here, you exchange um, portability for lack of ownership. Either Google owns your data, owns your identification and allows you to use their particular set of services with OpenID Connect, or the application owns your data, and then the application owners are allowed to use your data in however way that they wish, right? The old adage of if you're not paying for it, you're the product. But even that is probably, a little bit beyond the pale. So one, you either do have some portability, with OpenID Connect, but Google owns the data, owns the ID, or Apple or GitHub or whatever it is. Or two, the application owns the ID, owns it, and they can use the data and they can profit from it in whatever way they feel they can find uses for it, right? So they sell it, they sell it to an advertising agency, or sell it to some data mining group to drive some information from it, right? But you don't own it, application owns it, right? So ultimately, this is the problem. And having something like a Midnight network, even though it's very advanced, it allows us to do things in ways that you wouldn't be able to do them before. You can execute zero knowledge proofs, and you can have smart contracts, you can have generalized voting applications. But at this point in time, the only real way for them to execute these particular things is to go back and sort of utilize the services of OIDC or OpenOAuth or something like that, right? It doesn't change that old that old web2 legacy sort of stuff. It's all the same, right? So even though Midnight.network, you can create some fantastic applications, you don't own the data, even though it may very well be one of the requirements of Midnight Network is that it executes these things. It executes the ZKPs, the zero knowledge proofs, on the smart contracts from your private space information and the identity that it needs to execute from the private space are probably going to be provided by OpenIDC or OAuth, right? So in other words, these session tokens and stuff do exist and are going to exist on private space, but they will, Midnight Network will be able to use it, and it will be able to execute the zero knowledge proofs and the smart contracts. In Midnight Network sort of parlance, it's called a circuit. So it'll go from private space to public space. And the public space in this case would very well be, the public space is going to be the blockchain, a public blockchain. Okay, so this sort of process, this sort of method, will allow us to create some fantastic applications with Midnight Network that will allow us to do some amazing things, right? So in of itself, it does provide you some methodology to do things like have a generalized voting system, right? But again, we get down to this sort of thought process of what creates the private space. What gets to put info into private space so that the application, so that Midnight DApps can execute right? How does that work? Well, it could be because you use OpenID Connect or OAuth, and it puts a session token in your private space. And then you can execute a smart contract as zero knowledge proof on the existence of that session token or that OpenID Connect sort of JSON package. And you can even include some scope into the OpenID Connect JSON package that will allow you to give some authentication and authorization information. And it's actually, I love OpenID Connect. It works like a champ. You know, like I say, it sort of runs the internet now. And having midnight isn't going to change it because of this. Who owns it, right? So you don't own the data, even in midnight, unless it can execute on something that you've put there, right? So probably you could put together data that you own or identifications probably that you might not own, right? So the problem is just this. You still don't own the data. You know, you still don't own it. Own your identity. Honestly, big problem, right? It means you can't profit from it. You cannot take it and move it, right? And it's only uh it's a trade-off, I should say. It's a trade-off between some portability and uh specific app ownership. So it's a trade-off. So some portability for some specific app ownership. So if an application builds um, something where they use OAuth, essentially what they do then is provide a session token, and then all of the data um, is really owned by the application, right? So this is a big problem. And this is the classic web 2 problem. Web 2 problem. And even I've heard it, well, I should say I haven't heard it um, solved. So in other words, there's no situation where there's no applications I can tell where you can derive the benefits of portability and you don't have to trade off complete data ownership, right? Why can't you have both? Why can't, why cannot we have portability and why can't we own our data so that we can profit from it? Well, the problem is that permission sets permissions, in other words, applications, the permissions to the applications to do what it is that you want to do on the application are defined at the application layer. So in other words, they're defined within the application, right? And that's a legitimate thing. Like, for example, if you log into a game, um, you can maybe use Open OAuth where it gives you a session token, or maybe you can use Open Identity Connect, but all of this stuff that you do in the game that you derive permissions from, for example, are you a member of this group? Um, are you what items have you derived from adventuring in the world that the game has created, right? So all these become part of your identity within the game, right? But it's entirely the game's responsibility to build that stuff out for you and to then uh, basically, keep that identity, whatever it might be, right? And even in the best of circumstances, there is certainly going to be some identity stuff some permissions that are derived from within the game only. I mean, that's probably never going to go away completely, but that's fine. It doesn't need to, right? So when I talk about providing, a bridge between web 2 and web 3, this is what I'm talking about. Portability, identity ownership, right? How can we provide an objective way to provide portability and data ownership, right? So the idea then, Grokism. So created an app, Grokism, or a company, Grokism LLC. And the way it works is an organization it could be a business. It could be a DAO, for example. It could be, a game. It could be a government. And I'll explain some of the problems with government here in just a second. But what it does is you log in and you create bookends. And a bookend is a definition of your business and all the users that have permissions to do stuff in your business. So it might be user 1, user 2, user 3, and so on and so forth, right? And then what you do is you define a permission set. So each one of these, so a bookend, so let's say company 1 with its permission sets, perm sets, perm set, 5,000, perm set 5,000 and 10, 5,000. It doesn't really matter. These are just made up stuff, perm set numbers. They don't exist yet. So perm set 5,000 really just means that, well, I guess it's kind of up to the company to define what perm set 1,000. But the idea is to take these perm sets, match them with users, and then on the other side, to be able to use the perm set to build it into your D app to execute zero knowledge proofs and smart contracts with the definition of the perm set, right? So you're either giving permissions to a user to execute on the backside with the D app, or you're maybe removing permissions, right? So the idea is to match a permission set. So, user 1 may have permission set 5,000, 5,010, so 5,000, 5,010, 5,020, and this permit user 2 may only have access to 5,000, user 3 may have access to 5,000, 5,010, 5,020, right? Whatever it is, right? So essentially what you're doing is, as a business, you book in your business, you add a set of users, in this case, and then a set of permission sets that you define are linked to the user, right? And you're the one who gives, so as a business owner, you are the one who defines what those permissions should be and who should have them, right? So this is called a booking. So again, this could be a DAO, it could be a game, it could be anything. So what happens then is that when you create the bookend, so a bookend is, remember, it's that set of permissions, users and permissions. And then what it does is But I will say this, that the organization, the org that created the bookend is the owner of the bookend. Okay? The, the owner of the bookend owns the permission sets, and it owns essentially the information about the set of users that it puts in there, right? This gives it an ability to add users, to take away users, to change permission sets, to add permission sets, and so on and so forth, right? So once a bookend is created, what happens is for each one of these users in the bookend, essentially what happens is an email is sent. And then that user has an ability to say, yes, I accept booking permissions, booking perms. Okay, once it's accepted, then what happens is what is called a Grokism is created. A Grokism is created in such a way that because the user ID is still, it's gonna have, so this is gonna have a user ID here, but then this user ID that is created in a Grokism is different, right? So technically they're not the same users because this is sort of a translation process. So it goes through, it creates a new record, which is then, so it assigns this ID and some other additional information to the permission sets, right? And so a Grokism is the permission sets that are defined by the company, right? So the bookend has all kinds of information about that. So, but the difference is that, so this is sort of translated. I mean, you can describe it as I'll just say this is all on Mongo database, right? A Grokism then is translated from a bookend, and it has a information in it that is related to the permission sets that are defined by the bookend. But the difference is that the Grokism, the particular person, right? The user, the end user, owns it in the sense that there is a private key and it is, so in other words, this package of JSON information, package of JSON is encrypted so that so that it can only be decrypted by the use of the private key. So Grokism owns it. It's a set of information that is defined up here from the bookend with the users and permissions. And a Grokism is translated from that, and the JSON package that is ultimately created from a Grokism is encrypted, and the only people that can de-encrypt it is the ones with the private key, and in this case, the person. And no one can change it, no one can do anything with it except for the person with the use of the private key. And in MongoDB Atlas, there is a way to do this on the client side where you can encrypt the JSON package. You can encrypt what they call encrypting the document. So that can be done, right? So essentially what happens is you get added as a user, a Grokism. You get added as a user in Mongo. You are assigned permissions, proper permissions for access to the database. In other words, all the only permissions you have are really just part of the JSON package, the document that is associated with you, right? So and then it's encrypted, you're given the private key and basically told how to access it, right? So in short, company token, user permissions, translates to Grokking. Encrypts, gives end user key. Okay, and this is all done via the Grokism API, the Grokism API. Okay, and here's the thing though. The thing that interacts with the Grokism API then is the DApp on this side, right? So the DApp then is going to import all that information, and then when a user logs into the DApp, the API will grab it, right? It'll grab the Grokin, pass it to the DApp, where the DApp will have the key, be able to de-encrypt it and to see the information about permission sets and so on and so forth, right? So if you use, as a company up here, the idea is to create these bookends with the idea in mind that you're also going to create a DApp that can then import the information from the Grokin, right? So, and then ultimately, this DApp will have built into it this ability to execute zero knowledge proofs, execute ZKPs, smart contracts, and so on and so forth, and have access to a public blockchain with Midnight. So this will have Midnight on the backside. And this DApp will import the Grokin information into private space. That's kind of the whole point of it. And then zero knowledge proofs and smart contracts will get executed based on the existence of the information that's in the Grokin and the private space, right? So in a nutshell, this is it, right? And so what I'm calling this is that, and it's an authentication authorization oracle for Midnight. Okay. And with this combination of permission sets and being able to execute zero knowledge proofs and so on and so forth, it gives a DApp a lot of incredible power, including, let's say, so the Midnight, I'm going to spend a couple minutes here talking about the Grokism API. Okay. So what it can do is its basis, the Grokism API's basis is going to be this thing. It's going to use verified credentials, provided by something like a Hyperledger Identitas. Um, this is the former, this is a former Teleprism. IOHK decided, oh, I'm going to donate this so that it can be used, you know, for things like I'm using it for, right? So it's going to be composed of verified credential sort of mechanism, Hyperledger Identitas, so that we can use, you know, verifications from, from the DMV, right? But most of the problems with having verified credentials specifically are this idea of agreement. And I don't want to talk too much about this, but for example, to use a verified credential to prove, for example, that you are able to drive in the in the US or in the States or whatever it is, the DMV has to agree that showing and putting that credential in Hyperledger Identitas is going to be valid, right? So a lot of what we have to do to build up this sort of ability, this system to use, you know, verified credentials have to come about because of agreement, right? But you can have other verifiers, like you can have a company by, a company can verify it. Doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be the DMV. It could be a company, and by having a combination of verified credentials and the permission sets and everything like that. Basically, you're setting it up. I'm setting it up so that in the Grokism API, a company can look at when they in their DApp, they can look at if the permission set exists and if the verified credential exists, or if the OAuth, I should say, if the user has been booked into into the app on this side, we can be sure. In other words, we can be sure that it's proven, right? So the company can prove, or the user can prove that there is access, right? So there's a whole bunch of ways we can do this. But the other thing is that it's going to take it could take this verified credential. Now, imagine if a verified credential was all it has on it, for example, is your driver's license, which would include your name, your address, and so on and so forth, right? So the verified credential in and of itself doesn't say much, for example, about if you're allowed to vote in a certain election at a certain place, whatever it is. So what it could do is it could take verified credentials and it could take related but non-verified information and sort of put it together so that we can get some objective way of knowing that you have the rights, for example, to vote in a certain election in a certain place. So as far as I'm concerned, by putting together this information, puts together info, puts it in a private space, and you can use that information then to accomplish things in the DApp that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. For example, a company can be sure that they're interacting with someone who they know and who they trust, right? Um, a uh, a government can know, as long as we have this agreement, a government can know that the person voting it in this election at this time has, all the proper credentials, all the proper sort of methodologies to be able to vote in a certain election at a certain time and for a certain group of people. Like if you lived in some neighborhood in Minneapolis, for example, um, and you would not be able to vote, for example, for anyone in the St. Paul City Council, right? So in other words, you should not be allowed to vote in the St. Paul City Council meetings. And so there has to be some objective way to be able to determine through putting together a bunch of information and then serving it through the Grokism API, that you have these rights. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of the whole point of it, right? So, I mean, I can think of when I talk about use cases, the big one is, just that generalized voting app. A social media app that gives an end user, access, has the social media app that assumes ownership of the data that gets produced when that particular person, does some stuff in the social media app, right? And then the social media app would have to ask permission to utilize the data. And then ultimately you can make relationships and have smart contracts that execute, when the data is sold or used, so that the end user gets paid a little bit for the data use via smart contract, right? Because you own it, you own the data. To me, this is a powerful thing. Um, I mean, this is a sort of key to being able to interact, with government agencies, with social media apps, with some degree of anonymity. It gives you this ability to interact and utilize your identity in ways that you haven't been able to before. It allows portability of your identity. It allows ownership of it. It allows uh, you to generally, in an objective way, provide authentication and authorization information outside of the app owning it, or outside of Google or Apple or any OIDC verifier, right? So this is the best of both worlds, right? So it bridges the gap, between web2 and web3. So remember, Grokism started a company, and just in the process of building things out, I've made quite a lot of progress, but I have a lot to go, right? So if anyone is interested in providing some funding, some financing to help me continue to build this thing out, right? Um, I need to hire some developers. I need to hire web designers. I can only do so much. I'm one person, but to me, I think this is a powerful, very necessary sort of application that we need to really be functional in a Web2 world that will fulfill the promises of Web3. All right. Thanks, everyone. If you have any questions, write me an email at robert@grokism.com. All right. Thanks so much. Bye.